Welcome to the Georgia Archives Virtual Lunch and Learn program. I'm Penny Cliff, the Education Specialist here at the Archives. We're really glad that you joined us. Our Lunch and Learn programs are held on the second Friday of the month and are sponsored by Friends of Georgia Archives and History. Now, during this pandemic, we want to offer you Lunch and Learn programs safely in virtual format. This live presentation will be uploaded to our YouTube channel, Georgia Archives, and also to our website under our Programs and Education page. Now, if you click on the Q&A, it looks like a speech bubble. You can post your questions, which will be answered after the presentation. I am pleased to introduce my colleague, Collections Manager Dr. Hendry Miller. Originally from Barrow County, Hendry studied history at Valdosta State University and conducted graduate work at Florida State University, earning a PhD in 2017. His research and education focused on American history, particularly the colonial and early American South. His program today is Migration and Settlement in Early Georgia. Welcome, Hendry.
Thank you, Penny, for the kind introduction. And thank you all who's attending virtually. We're very glad to be able to put these programs on, and very glad that there is such enthusiasm to continue doing them in a virtual format. I think we've got everything up and running correctly, but I do want to mention that our two tech wizards on staff both happen to be out today. I myself am more of a tech gremlin, so hopefully I don't crash everything once I start the presentation, but we'll hope that everything goes smoothly. Thank you, Penny, for the kind introduction and for coordinating all of this. And so, as you can see from the title and the press releases that Penny put out, today I'm going to be talking about migration and settlement in early Georgia, and by early I do mean very early. We're going to focus on mostly the first 20 years to 30 years of colonial settlement. And as many of us know, Georgia was the 13th and final English colony established in North America. Georgia was founded in 1733. And so, as I mentioned, today I'm going to talk about Georgia's early founding and history, and focusing on the people that moved to and through the area. The movement of people and populations in Georgia gives us insight to a lot of things, and specifically motivations for why people were migrating. We can see these motivations on personal and individual levels, such as people seeking a new life in North America. And we can also see how European and colonial governments encouraged and subsidized settlement in the colonies through various means. Such as recruiting people to relocate, or through adversarial policies that would encourage people to try and leave because of bad government policies in Europe. In Georgia's specific case, we had the example of the English hoping that the new colony would be a landing place for the noble poor who filled England's debtors' prison. We also see the governmental policies, like I mentioned, that encourage people to flee their homes, like religious persecution. And lastly, we can't really talk about colonial settlement in North America without talking about involuntary migrations of both Native peoples and of African descended peoples that were displaced by the colonial world. So what we'll get into today, like I said, is the migration and settlement patterns in colonial Georgia, focusing on what brought people to the southeast, some resistance to the newcomers, and then talk a little bit about what goes on after the colonial era. And after that, I'll highlight some of our colonial era resources available on the virtual vault, and show you where you can find some of the items that are displayed in this presentation. So before discussing Georgia as a colony, it's important to remember that there were a lot of migrations and movements through the area that became Georgia prior to 1733. South Carolina was founded in the 1670s. A little bit further north, you have Virginia, and further south, we have the Spanish in Florida from the 1500s. So there's a lot of Europeans already kind of in this, this area, and of course, Native American tribes. So Georgia's principal founder, James Edward Oglethorpe, the English colonists that landed at the Savannah River in 1733, met with TOMOCHICHI, a Yamacraw Indian, who acted as a liaison between his town, the Georgia colonists, and his Creek relatives further to the west. So the question that we have to answer is, why was TOMOCHICHI there at the Yamacraw Bluffs, the site of where Savannah would be founded, in the first place? And so the answer is native migrations, which were going on for close to 200 years as a result of European colonization, and hundreds of years before that internally to native North America. In TOMOCHICHI's specific case, there were internal pressures and external pressures on native peoples. So contact with Europeans and the associated trade in goods, culture, and disease drastically reshaped native societies and where they lived in the Southeast. Prior to and in the early stages of colonial contact, Southeastern Native Americans consisted mostly of hierarchical, centralized societies called chiefdoms. The Spanish, French, English, and other European colonists brought with them diseases that Native Americans had no resistance to. These diseases, such as smallpox and measles, swept through Indian communities, leading to mass depopulation and the collapse of those hierarchical chiefdoms. Surviving native groups began to relocate and restructure their societies, forming more familiar groups in the Deep South interior, groups like the Choctaw or Creek or Cherokee. This process led to and developed from a great deal of internal migration. Communities tried to remove themselves from areas racked by European disease. So they were trying to distance themselves from infected areas, but in doing so, they may have unintentionally taken pathogens with them to new areas and unintentionally spread disease. As European colonists established themselves more on the Atlantic coast, different native groups sought trade opportunities. We see a good deal of migration and resettlement among native peoples once they began to develop resistance to diseases to be closer to trading partners. And they could often sort of play off the different European powers, say, oh, the French are giving us these better deals, English settlers, what can you give us? But with these trade opportunities, we also see trade dependencies. Things that were luxuries a generation or two ago become necessity now. And so these trade dependencies lead to increased conflict between native groups that were allied to different colonial powers. And so we see increasing warfare, both native-driven and colonial power-driven. One of these wars in particular was the 1715 Yamasee War, where Yamasee Indians, who were a town loosely connected to the emerging Creek tribe further west, nearly overthrew the South Carolina colony because of trade abuses by English traders and English encroachment on their land. This is a slide, this is a map from the British archives that shows the Southeast in about 1715, right as the Yamasee War breaks out. And this shows Charleston and the trading paths leading to what became Georgia and Alabama and Mississippi, and up here into Tennessee, these trading paths the traders would take from Charleston. And we click here again. I've got a little bit more detail where you can see the location of the Yamasee tribe and some of the different towns right on the eve of the the Yamasee War. The Yamasee War went on for about 2 years until the English convinced other natives to no longer side with the Yamasees, leading to an end of their coalition to fight the English. And as a result of this warfare and the rebuilding of after epidemics, native groups began forming defensive alliances, sort of as we already talked about, like the Creek or the Cherokee. And other groups, and TOMOCHICHI's Yamacraw tribe was an example of this. They remained allied with the English, and they moved closer to their allies in South Carolina. And so this is what set the stage for TOMOCHICHI's town to be the ones that negotiated with Oglethorpe when they initially settled. And this is an entry from the transaction of the trustees of Georgia. This is from 1739. And this is the transaction of the trustees were the board that governed the colony of Georgia. All of them but Oglethorpe stayed in England. And so when they got news, they'd have the meetings and talk about what was going on. And so this entry notes that TOMOCHICHI's tribe, or his town, appeared not so tractable as before. And some of them were making preparation with the Creek Nation to attack Indians in Florida who were allied with the Spanish. And the last line notes that TOMOCHICHI would try to prevent it. And so this is hoping to prevent getting entangled into too much colonial warfare. And it just, this is shortly before TOMOCHICHI passed away in October of 1739. But it just shows his influence among the Georgia trustees. They thought a lot of TOMOCHICHI. Okay, another form of population movement that helped spur the creation of Georgia was the movement of enslaved peoples out of English-held colonies on the Atlantic coast and into Florida. As part of the European powers' colonial conflicts, the Spanish crown offered freedom and refuge to any person who professed Catholicism. This policy was in effect as early as the 1690s, excuse me, the 1690s. And so the movement and migrations of freedom-seeking peoples from the Carolinas into Spanish territory, in part, created one of the reasons created Georgia. The English wanted a military buffer between the valuable plantations in South Carolina and Spanish holdings in Florida, and they wanted a buffer to prevent enslaved Africans from seeking freedom. And so this is a document available on the virtual vault that's an account of the Battle of Bloody Marsh, which happened in 1742, and we'll talk about that and the War of Jenkins' Ear a little bit more later. But this is a list of Spanish resources that were fighting the English under Oglethorpe. And here we see a regiment of African peoples that were officered by their own people. So the Floridian Africans who had their own militia regiment. And this last line, 15 African descended peoples who had run away from South Carolina. So there's a very real sense of movement of people going from English colonies into Spanish-held Florida seeking freedom. And so that was one of the impetuses. I don't know if that's a word, I may have just made it up, but that was one of the reasons why Georgia was created. So I know that's a quick jump through 200 years of colonial history. If anyone has any more specific questions about that, I'll try to address them at the end of the presentation. All right, so once again, and I've already mentioned, I'm sure many of us are aware that Georgia was founded as an attempt to assist the worthy poor that filled English debtors' prisons. Georgia's founder, James Edward Oglethorpe, had seen the overcrowded prisons firsthand. He was on a government commission, English government commission, to study and address the prison population. And one of the reasons behind this high prison population was the enclosure movement, in which wealthy landowners forced people off of their lands and converted farmlands into sheep pastures, thereby enclosing the land. People who were forced off the lands flooded into cities and towns looking for work, and they sunk into debt if they were unable to find it, unable to find work. So Oglethorpe and several of his like-minded, reform-oriented colleagues proposed to the English crown that they serve as trustees for a new colony south of the Savannah River, named after King George II, to assist debtors. The plan was later altered to focus on the deserving poor rather than debtors specifically. And the trustees' plan was that Georgia would be populated by smallholding farmers who could, working land that could not be sold or accumulated in order to prevent land speculation. And another key was that these small holding farmers would serve in the militia so that they could provide for their own defense. And they would create that military buffer between South Carolina and Spanish Florida. So Oglethorpe and the trustees, they wanted to help the deserving poor, as they called them. They were reform-minded, and they wanted a military colony that could provide for its own defense. This is another excerpt from the transaction of the trustees. And Oglethorpe, who was the only trustee who ever went to Georgia, wrote to the trustees, and this is 1741, close to the end of his tenure as administrator of the colony. Oglethorpe wrote to the trustees about the trial of one militia captain for killing another in a duel. The guilty party was brought up on manslaughter, but the entry mentions that the person's widow was going to ask for a new trial in England. And so here we see the military colony and things getting out of hand if we've got a duel going on. And like I say, this is also available in the transaction of the trustees, which are available on the virtual vault. All right, so the trustees, they petitioned the crown, and they got a charter to govern the colony of Georgia, and it lasted for about 20 years. So the first, during the trustee era, the first English settlers, the first settlers in Georgia, were 120 charity colonists, mostly from London. They set sail in 1732, and as I mentioned before, Oglethorpe was the only trustee to ever go to Georgia. So Oglethorpe took it upon himself as the leader of this colony to go. After having negotiated for permission with TOMOCHICHI, Oglethorpe and the settlers landed at the site of Savannah in February of 1733 and began laying out the town. Construction in Savannah was aided initially by enslaved persons from nearby Charleston. Oglethorpe feared, however, that slave labor would make other settlers idle and be less inclined to work, and with the London trustees' support, he banned slavery in the colony. This was also as much for practical purposes as anything else. Georgia was supposed to be a military buffer, and settlers needed to serve in the militia. And fear of enslaved persons causing insurrections and uprisings preventing colonies from arming enslaved people. So it's can be seen as altruistic and also self-serving. fearing that the settlers would become idle, and also the fear of arming enslaved people. As I mentioned, settlers from London dominated the first group. At least one of the initial settlers had been in a debtor's prison at one point in the past, but none of the colonists that came to Georgia under the trustees were ever freed directly from a debtor's prison and given passage to Georgia. Some of the push factors, the reasons that people felt inclined to leave, we've already mentioned: the enclosure movement, low prospects for employment in their home country, and indebtedness. During the early colonial period under the trustees, most of the roughly 3,000 people that came to Georgia came directly from Europe. Most of these early settlers were subsidized by the trustees, so their passage was offset by them. And as we'll talk about here in a second, the early settlers were racked by diseases in Georgia's low country. And also, this being subsidized by the trustees, they weren't just given a blank check to go to Georgia. The trustees paid their passage to the colony and provided provisions for 1 year, agricultural tools, and a piece of land to work, but it was in exchange for labor. So ironically, this form of indentured servitude continued the cycle of debt that the Georgia trustees initially hoped to prevent. So those 3,000 settlers during the 20 years of the trustee period, most of them come directly from Europe. And about 1/3 of them that arrived during the trusteeship died, many from malaria, typhoid, and other diseases that were rampant around the Georgia low country, creeks, rivers, and marshes. It was so much so, in fact, that by July of 1733, so a few months into the colony, 20 of the settlers had died, including their doctor. So the first settlers that come to Georgia that were not from the trustees were actually Jewish refugees who were coming from England, and many of them had come from different parts of Europe. They arrived unexpectedly in Savannah on July 11th, 1733. And that's 286 years and 364 days ago, if anyone is counting. So 1 day shy of 287 years. This English ship carrying about 40 Jewish men and women arrived in Savannah. And among them was Dr. Samuel Nunez, who was originally from Portugal, and he saw that the colony didn't have a doctor, and he immediately began attending to the sick settlers. Many of these Jewish refugees were originally from Portugal. They were fleeing the Inquisition, though some came from other parts of Europe. They came to England, where they were then sponsored by a Jewish benevolent society to come to Georgia. They never, however, sought explicit permission from the trustees. Oglethorpe and the other Georgia colonists were certainly surprised at the arrival of the Jewish settlers, but Dr. Nunez and his assistants to the colony proved incredibly useful. Him being able to treat the ill colonists was incredibly useful. And Oglethorpe wrote of Dr. Nunez, quote, "He immediately undertook our people and refused to take any pay for it. The sick have wonderfully recovered, and we have not lost one who would follow his prescriptions." So they show up unannounced, but they're providing useful services to the colony. But there was the fact that they didn't seek explicit permission from the trustees' council. Georgia was intended to be a haven for religious persecutees from Europe. And Here, this is the detail of the royal charter that actually established Georgia. It said that all persons except papists, meaning Catholics, shall have free exercise of their religion. It never specifically included or excluded Jewish settlers. The trustees wrote to Oglethorpe and said these people didn't have our permission, so you need to kick them out. And Oglethorpe, sort of setting a precedent for his relationship with the trustees for the next 8 or 10 years, simply ignored them. He understood that the colony needed a doctor, and he welcomed them to stay. So these Jewish settlers are helping the colony. They have diverse backgrounds, so they share a common religion, but the larger part of them were from the Iberian Peninsula, called Sephardic Jews, and a smaller group of them were from other parts of Europe, called Ashkenazi Jewish. And other than their religion, they did have some disagreements among the culturally different folks. And then in sort of the big turning point in colonial Georgia history, the War of Jenkins' Ear in the 1740s fought between Georgia colonists and the Spanish, and part of a larger colonial war. Many of the Sephardic Jewish people from the Iberian Peninsula actually fled the Georgia colony from fear of persecution by the Spanish. That's what they had left Europe, as one of the reasons they left Europe in the first place. So those folks relocated to South Carolina and New York, and the Jewish community that remained, although they were relatively small in number, they established the third oldest Jewish congregation in what became the United States. During the remainder of the colonial era and at the beginning of the early republic, Georgia's Jewish population experienced growth and tolerance, though they primarily stayed in Savannah. So they showed up kind of unexpectedly, but they were helping out the colony, and Oglethorpe let them stay against the instructions of the other trustees. The next group of religious immigrants that came to Georgia were called the Salzburgers. These were German Lutherans who were expelled from the Austrian Principality of Salzburg in 1731. This community made their way to other parts of Europe before King George II offered them land in Georgia in 1734. In that year, about 300 Salzburgers arrived in Georgia, where Oglethorpe provided them with land about 25 miles from Savannah, where they founded the town of Ebenezer. Other German Protestants eventually came to Georgia as well, and they shared the common language, so they settled around Ebenezer as well. And despite their being from different areas, they were all kind of called Salzburgers by the outsiders. The Salzburg settlement was headed by Minister Johann Martin Bolzius, and he provided sort of steady leadership for the community. The initial site of Ebenezer featured the same problems, of disease and discomfort as other low-lying areas, and the Salzburg settlement petitioned for better land on the bluffs above Savannah, where they formed New Ebenezer in 1736. The trustees considered the Salzburgers to be model colonists. They supported the trustees' government. They exercised a high level of religious devotion. They shunned slavery. They shunned plantation agriculture, and they focused their efforts on modest self-sufficiency, living a lifestyle that the trustees envisioned for the entire colony. Their farms prospered. They operated grist mills, sawmills, and undertook silk manufacturing, which was a specific vision of the trustees. They thought that Georgia would be a perfect place to grow silkworms, and thought that that could pave the way for the colony, so that the Salzburgers undertook that. They were highly supported by the trustees, and they supported the trustees back. The Salzburgers operated Georgia's first Sunday school in 1734, Georgia's first orphanage in 1737, and they constructed the Jerusalem church, which is pictured here, which was completed in 1769 and still stands. Part of the Salzburgers' success can be attributed to their initial isolation. They were sort of separated from the other colonists in Savannah, and their ardent support for the trustees. That disappeared, their success sort of disappeared after Georgia became a crown colony and began issuing lents for the land around Ebenezer. And their wholehearted support of the trustees left them with few political allies after the end of the trustee era. The community became increasingly multicultural as Salzburgers married into other settlers' families, and they also suffered from a lack of clear leadership after Bolzius died in 1765. And then lastly, the Revolutionary War racked the community. British troops actually used Ebenezer as a headquarters, and most of the Salzburgers fled the area looking for opportunities elsewhere. All right, so there's another group of European Protestants to settle in Georgia shortly after the Salzburgers, and they're called the Moravians. The Moravians were German-speaking Protestants from the modern Czech Republic. They arrived in Georgia in 1735 with a mission to hope to convert non-Christians to Christianity and then to unite all Christian denominations into one unified denomination. They initially hoped to settle near the Salzburgers in Ebenezer, but instead they lived in a communal settlement in Savannah. They were distrusted by other settlers and other Protestant groups for their ambitions to unite all the Protestant denominations under one. They were also distrusted because they were pacifists and they allowed women to preach and hold church office. So they were slightly mistrusted by other settlers. They hoped to bring other European religious refugees to Georgia, but their plans for sponsored immigration fell through as the immigrants that they actually hoped to sponsor decided to go to Pennsylvania instead, which was a more established colony and was already very religiously tolerant. And this prevented the Moravian colony from growing. So they stayed small and they never really had clear leadership in Georgia. They then began trying to convert nearby Native American tribes and enslaved persons in nearby South Carolina, and they found little success in either community, especially as slave owners prevented missionaries from preaching to enslaved people. In Georgia, as I mentioned, the Moravians were ostracized and distrusted for their odd beliefs, but the community really collapsed because of a lack of leadership among them and internal bickering. By 1745, most Moravians had fled Georgia for other colonies. They were never very populous in Georgia, but Georgia was the group's first attempt at colonization in North America. And although they never had success in bringing other immigrants to Georgia, they were successful in other colonies like North Carolina and Pennsylvania. After the Revolutionary War, Moravian missionaries did find more success among the Cherokees in northwestern Georgia, and this is an image of the Uthkaloga Moravian Mission, which is in modern Gordon County. This operated from 1822 to 1833. So like I said, they had a small numbers in Georgia and a very short stay initially, but they did have success bringing Europeans to other North American colonies and established missions in Georgia later on. The last sort of identifiable group of European settlers in very early Georgia that we'll talk about today were Highland Scots. These were refugees of a different type. While the Jewish settlers, Salzburgers, and Moravians were all religious refugees, the Highland Scots were refugees of the enclosure movement and increased land rents in general. Highland Scots were considered to be among the most highly capable soldiers of the time period, and Oglethorpe and the trustees actively recruited the Highland Scots because they thought that they would enhance Georgia's military mission, and it allowed an outlet for the destitute conditions in the Scottish Highlands. Further, the trustees recruited the Scots to immigrate in entire family groups, therefore transplanting communities and allowing for that idealized community of Georgia's trustees, which would be yeoman farmers who could provide for their own defense. The Scots settled along the Altamaha River and eventually called their settlement Darien. They named it Darien after a failed Scottish colony in Panama, and they called it Darien as a defiant gesture toward the Spanish rivals in Florida. They settled on the abandoned site of Fort King George, which was an earlier outpost that was destroyed in the 1720s under mysterious circumstances. Many historians seem to think that the soldiers stationed there really didn't want to be there. And when a fire broke out, whether they said it or not, they certainly weren't quick to help put it out. But anyway, that's where the Darien, the Scots settled at Darien on the Altamaha River. And shortly after the establishment of Darien, the Scots helped carry out the trustees' vision for Georgia as a military colony. Under Oglethorpe's leadership, they began constructing fortifications along the coastal islands. And in 1740, when the War of Jenkins' Ear broke out between European powers over territorial disputes and shipping rights, the Scots served with Oglethorpe. First in a 1740 attempt to take St. Augustine in Florida, which failed. And after that, Oglethorpe and his forces returned to St. Simon's Island, where they manned Fort Frederica in anticipation of a Spanish invasion. The invasion happened in the summer of 1742. The Spanish approached, but were repelled by Georgian troops, including the Scots, at the Battle of Bloody Marsh. And although the war would continue in Europe for several years, the battles on the Georgia frontier effectively ended. The Highland Scots played an integral role in the colony's defense and established deep ties to the Altamaha and Darien after the war. While many of them lost their lives fending off the invasion, others returned to focus on cattle herding, timber production, and trade with Native American tribes. And after the trustees dropped the ban on African slavery, many Scots began establishing rice plantations along the Altamaha. So they had deep connections to the area. This is also from the ad hoc collection on the Georgia Virtual Vault. This is a detail of strategies to defeat the Spanish. And we can see here that they're specifically mentioning the Highland Company as very useful in fending off the Spanish. All right, so the trustee era, as I mentioned, lasted for about 20 years. It ended in 1732. And as I also mentioned, the trustees initially banned the use of slave labor. Their idealized settlement of smallholders diligently working the land did not mesh with the established plantation cultures elsewhere in the colonial world. Oglethorpe himself instituted the ban after returning to Savannah from Charleston to see settlers idle while enslaved Africans worked. This ban was widely supported by the settlers that received assistance from the trustees. The Salzburgers and Moravians supported the ban on religious principles, and the Darien Scots felt that the introduction of slavery to the colony would devalue free labor, and they also called perpetual slavery, quote, shocking to human nature. The agitation for introducing slavery to the colony came from South Carolina planters hoping to expand their land holdings in Georgia, and from settlers who had paid their own way to the colony, and they called themselves the malcontents. They argued that the trustees' plan was not economically viable, and the colony depended on British Parliament for funds, and the British Parliament would not see any return on their investment if it was just small farmers eking out a living. Further, Oglethorpe's relationship with the other trustees declined precipitously after the War of Jenkins' Ear, and they recalled him to England and replaced him with William Stevens in the early 1740s. Stevens had power to grant land, and he was more sympathetic to the malcontents' complaints than Oglethorpe was. Stevens began issuing large land grants and thereby increasing the calls for enslaved labor to work those lands, though initially the trustees left the ban in place. Despite that, many of the landowners began bringing in enslaved persons anyway, and Stevens sort of turned a blind eye until the slavery ban was lifted in 1750, and Georgia became a royal colony in 1752. And this set the stage for new migration patterns for people coming to Georgia. Wealthy men getting large land grants dominated these migration patterns and Georgia's politics after the trustee era ended. Before, most of the migrants came directly from Europe, and after the end of the trusteeship, migrants were mostly coming from other parts of the British colonial world, particularly South Carolina and the Caribbean colonies. And these people getting large land grants often had enslaved persons already, and they began bringing enslaved people with them. This plat is from the Colonial Plats and Warrants, available on the virtual vault. It's a plat for Jonathan Bryan, who was originally from South Carolina, and he began securing land grants in Georgia in the 1750s. By his death in 1788, he had amassed over 32,000 acres of land in Georgia and South Carolina, having the land worked by more than 250 enslaved persons. And he typifies the planter elite that emerged after the end of the trustee era. All right, so the last group of people that we'll talk about today are those enslaved persons that plantation owners brought with them. So that, like I said, the first wave of enslaved people in Georgia came from the planters who were bringing them from other colonies. We also see some enslaved persons coming directly from Africa. This is a proclamation from a period a little bit later than what we're focusing on, 1769, that mentions a boat, the Britannia, that came directly from the coast of Africa, and it's suspected to have smallpox on it. So this proclamation is directing that the ship be isolated on Tybee Island until the disease passes. We also see enslaved persons coming with them from the Caribbean and other colonies. And in colonial Georgia, they were mainly working on very labor-intensive rice plantations, which also had a very high mortality rate because of the difficulty in working the rice plantations and dangerous animals like water moccasins and alligators that frequented the rice fields. So this rise in plantation agriculture and the introduction of enslaved people drove down the value of free labor, and it also drove up the cost of enslaved persons in the colonial world. The cost of slaves in Charleston tripled from 60 pounds, it's tripled to 60 pounds from 20 after slavery was allowed in Georgia. And the other type of movement we're talking about enslaved persons is people seeking their freedom, runaways still trying to make it to Florida in hopes of creating their own freedom from enslavement. All right, so closing the colonial era, we see large landowners and people getting head right grants based on the number of people in their family or the number of slaves they had. So they're able to continue getting more land, and the plantation elite dominates. African slavery quickly was entrenched as the method of labor in Georgia. Smallholders, individual family farmers who request land often get marginal lands where they can't support themselves, and when their farms fail, they go into town, go into Savannah, and perhaps end up in debt. And we see Georgia's newly established assembly passed a vagabond law that was intended to discourage poor people from settling in Georgia. So 25 years after Georgia was founded as a theoretical haven for the noble poor, the colony passed laws to keep them out. People who could not support themselves could be imprisoned or impressed to serve in the British Navy. And we also see settlers encroaching on Indian lands. And this is a proclamation that mirrors the British Proclamation of 1763, which states settlers should not illegally be on Indian lands. The last line reads that they were requiring all persons whatsoever who may either willingly or inadvertently have seated themselves upon any lands so reserved or claimed by the said Indians, forthwith to remove themselves, as they will answer the contrary at their peril. So translated into modern language, if you're settled on Native American land, the colony is not going to support you, so you should remove yourself. And this was a somewhat unpopular decision in the colonial Southeast, and one of the reasons that Georgia and other Southern colonies supported the move for independence. So I'm running out of time a little bit, so we'll just go through this last slide real quick. Georgia was founded with some reform-minded beginnings. There were some successes and some malcontented settlers. But the shift from the trustee to the royal era changed dramatically the way Georgia operated as a colony. It went from a small military buffer to a large landowner, plantation owner dominated society. And on the eve of the revolution, almost half of the people in the colony are African descended. After the revolution in Georgia, we see more settlement. And we see land frauds, and we also see Georgia as a jumping off place. And that will have to be a different lunch and learn. Some resources for continuing your research. I've got some books here that help me put this lunch and learn presentation together. And I was going to show the how to get to the virtual vault, but as I think we're running out of time. The best way to get there is to go to our website, georgiaarchives.org, and go to the featured content, and the virtual vault is the first collection, the first link listed. And from the virtual vault, You can go to the ad hoc collection and limit the time period to the colonial era. And there's several documents from the colonial era available there. And then we also have these other specific collections, the colonial conveyances, which were effectively land sales between private individuals, colonial estate records, colonial plats and warrants, colonial will books, and colonial wills. A lot of these, especially the estate records and the will records, have information that duplicates each other, but it's best if you're searching for a colonial will to search all of those collections. And if you have specific questions, you can contact us via our reference phone number or our Ask an Archivist. I see that I have Ask Us in the reference room. That's not quite feasible yet. We're still suspended access to the public. So if you have questions, contact us via our Ask an Archivist form or our reference phone number. And I think from there, I'll turn it over to some questions that we might have had. I went a little bit longer than I thought I would and got long-winded. So we'll try and take a couple of questions if we have time.
Okay. Let's see. Who were the first Africans in the Georgia settlement and then in the first phase of the plantation era?
The first Africans in the Georgia settlement, I don't know if they would be identified by name, but they were enslaved persons living in Charleston who were brought over to help lay out and build the town of Savannah. And so, as I mentioned, Oglethorpe left to Charleston. When he came back, he saw the enslaved persons doing all the work and all of the settlers doing nothing. And that's what led to the ban on slave labor in Georgia. I'm not sure if their names have been recorded, but that is the first ones where they were coming from was Charleston.
Here's another one from Jan. One of my ancestors received an English crown grant in 1769 in St. Paul's Parish. What was a crown grant and who was eligible to receive one?
The crown grants would be covered in the Colonial Plats and Warrants collection on the virtual vault. So you may have seen it, you may be able to get access to it there. The crown grants, basically before the end of the revolution, or before the revolution, the crown gave all the land in Georgia. So the Georgia governor, person could petition to the Georgia governor to get land, but the crown would have had to approve it. I'm not sure of the particulars, but there's an excellent book called Georgia Land Surveying History and Law that explains how the crown grants would have worked and then how the headright grants would have worked after Georgia became independent and joined the United States. And it would explain both the reasoning, the rationale, and the law. So once again, that book is called Georgia Land Surveying History and Law. It's by an author named Ferris Cadle, C-A-D-L-E.
Helen asks, my ancestor Daniel Walcon was in Halifax District by 1762. Are there records in Georgia pertaining to individuals who were in the English militia? He was accompanied by his wife and 2 children.
Those records would probably be in Candler, the colonial records of the state of Georgia. Candler undertook a big project in the early 1900s to transcribe and compile a lot of the English records relating to Georgia and some of the colonial records that the Georgia archives still have. So that would probably be the first place to look, the colonial records of the state of Georgia. And it could also be in the British Public Archives as well. But that would probably be the first place to look, is the colonial records of the state of Georgia.
John asks, does the Georgia State Archives have any resources regarding the British military establishment in Georgia during the 1740s and the war with the Spanish in Florida?
Those would be in the ad hoc collection. It was one of the items that I showed an excerpt from, but the document is called Military Strategies to Defeat the Spanish. And that's available on the virtual vault and the ad hoc collection in its entirety.
Did the promise of religious freedom attract Quakers?
In Georgia, if we look at the situation that happened with Moravians, I'm not sure specifically. In all the research putting this together, I didn't see anything about Quakers. But if we compare it to the experiences of the Moravians, people didn't want to go to the newly formed colony when they could have gone to Pennsylvania, which had been established much earlier and already had a reputation for religious tolerance and already had a Quaker community. So there weren't sizable numbers that I came across, especially in this early period. And like I said, there was already an established place that Quakers were settling in North America, and so that's probably where they would go. Greg
asks, does the Georgia Archives hold any specific records of Dr. Nunez's prescriptions or medical actions and cures undertaken by various types of physicians in the colony during this period?
I am not sure about that. Most of what we have are a little bit later, and much of the reports about Dr. Nunez assisting the colony would have been in letters from Oglethorpe back to the trustees. So I do not think that the Georgia Archives has any of that, but I could definitely check into that.
Okay, let's see. We have right here, go up a little bit. Okay, this is an easy one here. Who authored the Charter of 1732?
I know that King George II signed it. I'm not sure who actually authored it. Penny, do you know? No, okay.
Okay.
I think we got time for maybe one more question, okay, if there is one.
There's a few.
And Penny, thank you for facilitating this. Penny, the moderator here, is helping us out.
You're welcome. Let's see. Who were the first Africans in the Georgia settlement and then in the first phase of the plantation era?
I think we already addressed that one. Like I said, the first folks were coming from South Carolina and in 1733 and led to the ban on slave labor. And being able to identify those people by name is probably going to be very difficult. So.
Okay. Oh, this is just a comment here. The Quakers came to Georgia much later, around 1768. The town was Wrightsboro in present-day McDuffie County.
Okay. All right. Thank you for that.
So there's a question about the resources page. Mm-hmm. Where they can actually get this.
All right, so like I said, this will be, the recording will be put on our Georgia Archives YouTube channel. It's something that we're just starting to do. My colleague Tamika's Lunch and Learn from last month is already available up there. The slide deck, I believe, will be put on our programs page, and then all of the resources that are available online are going to be on the Georgia Virtual Vault, which you can get to from our main page. Go ahead.
This is actually a really good question to end on. Does Georgia have slaveholder records?
So a lot of the records from this time period would probably be in the the Georgia proclamations, governor proclamations, which would be available on the virtual vault. The thing with plantation records is they're more like private business records. So they may not have to be turned over to the government. And so we don't officially collect them. So you would have to search our Gill catalog, which is our book and private manuscript catalog, because we do have records for some enslaved plantation owners, slave owners, in the private records, private manuscripts collection. But then the other thing, you would have to think about how these slave owners' lives would interact with the government. So you would have to look at tax records, court records, county court records, those type of things. Unfortunately, it's not that these type of records are compiled together in one place. So it's a good question, but it's sort of one step leads to more steps of research. And so if you have any questions about that, like I say, please write in to Ask an Archivist or call us on our reference line. And once again, I would like to thank you all for attending, and I would thank Penny for serving as our moderator and coordinator for all of this.
Thank you.
Thank you.